Original Gangster, Frank Lucus Book Study Summary. Chapter 1, Surviving on the Streets of Harlem. Frank arrived in New York, Harlem, alone as a young teenager in the mid-1940s. As a teenager, Frank had very little money to his name, so rather than starve and be homeless, Frank had to do whatever he had to just survive. Frank started out robbing people, stealing from people, and then eventually started selling drugs on the streets. Frank was living on a day-to-day basis. Every day was like a wolf hunting for food. Frank had to hustle every day to just survive. Frank was not getting a monthly salary to live off. Frank had to steal or rob, just to get some money to buy some food and accommodation on a day-to-day basis. Frank had robbed from the wrong people, and had now become a marked man to be killed. Frank had gotten to the point where he would either have to kill to protect himself, or be killed himself by somebody he had robbed. Meeting Bumpy Johnson. Frank accidentally bumped into an underworld boss of criminal entrepreneurship. Bumpy Johnson met Frank Lucus in a pool hall. Bumpy put a bet on Frank to beat another guy at billiards pool. Bumpy was a criminal boss. He was not a street thug roaming the streets. He was a well-respected and feared person in New York. For reasons unknown, Bumpy took Frank Lucus under his wing. Bumpy became aware of Frank's situation. Bumpy asked Frank where he was staying, how much money he had, and his overall living arrangements. Perhaps Bumpy wanted to help young Frank at this point, and that's when Frank became Bumpy's driver from this point onwards. Bumpy bought Frank new clothing, and got him a place to stay permanently. After 2 months in New York, doing whatever he could to just survive, Frank now had a steady job as a driver, got regular pay and a place to stay. For the first time, Frank had some security. From this point on, Frank Lucus was with Bumpy until the day he died. His place was at the right side of Bumpy Johnston. Frank says, "I listened, I observed, and I learned. I didn't ask questions, I just followed orders. I learned everything about how the king of Harlem ran his enterprise." Bumpy became a pivotal mentor for Frank. He got a first-person perspective on how to make a livelihood in criminal entrepreneurship from a boss at the top of the pecking order. Bumpy got up early and went to bed early, no late nights. Bumpy made his livelihood by offering protection services to all of the local businesses, the butcher, the corner grocery store. He would simply collect his money from 10 to 20 shops on a regular basis. This was a very profitable business that kept rolling in on a month-to-month basis. Frank says Bumpy was a major mentor in criminal entrepreneurship. It was like going to college. I was in school majoring in underworld criminal entrepreneurship. Frank's main duties were carrying out the more mundane tasks that needed doing in Bumpy's operation. Frank was grateful to have a steady income, but he was bored. There were times when Frank would be thinking, did I come to Harlem to be comfortable, to have an apartment, car, and a regular job? Frank was in a dilemma. He was taking legal risks that could get him locked up. Frank thought that for such risks, why not try and make it big in New York? Frank had an ambition to make big money for the legal risks he was taking. Working for Bumpy was similar to a regular 9-to-5 job. Frank would be expected to work every day and be there on time and do the tasks he was given, not that glamorous as the movies portrays. Frank would always watch the news on a regular basis. From watching the news on a regular basis, the following words rang in Frank's head: cheaper and stronger, cheaper and stronger. This was relating to the heroin that was being used by American soldiers in Vietnam. Frank thought that if he could get it imported into New York City, then they could make a fortune from selling it on the streets. Frank Lucus presented his idea to Bumpy before he died, but quickly dismissed it. He explained that it would be highly profitable, but Bumpy never took to the idea, so Frank Lucus shelved it for now. One day, Bumpy died at a dinner in New York, which was thought to be a heart attack. After Bumpy's death, Frank Lucus took over as the boss. It was now Frank who was the one collecting all of the protection money. Shortly after the death of Bumpy, Frank had $3 million that was now his to spend as he liked. Frank decided shortly after Bumpy's death that he would spend the protection money, that he had to buy some cheaper and stronger heroin in Vietnam. He could buy heroin at a far cheaper price and sell it on the streets of New York for a greater profit margin than the competition. Frank began planning how he was going to do this. He wanted to do this with the United States Army planes, rather than smuggling it through a commercial flight. At this point, Frank had no contacts in Vietnam. He had no United States Army connections, so it was an ambitious plan to even try. Frank planned to bribe United States servicemen to get his heroin shipped over in the Army planes. Frank carefully planned out how he was going to fulfill his plan. For days and days, Frank would contemplate, thinking through every step needed to be done to get the end result or outcome he wanted. Frank very carefully reverse-engineered his path towards getting his plan to work, identifying the main steps he had to take to get the job done. After putting together his plan, Frank flew to Bangkok International Airport. He then got a taxi to the hotel. After settling down, Frank asked a local taxi driver to take him to a popular American bar in the central area of Bangkok. Sitting in an American bar, full of people drinking and taking drugs, one person muttered to Frank saying, "This shit is ultra pure, there is nothing like this back in New York." Frank began asking people around the bar where he could buy kilograms of heroin. Frank was trying to strike lucky to get a connection to a major supplier, but most of the time it was street dealers who had very little amounts of drugs to be purchased. Frank says the whole essence of his trip to Bangkok was to not get lots of other people involved in his own business. Frank just wanted to find a direct source to buy large amounts of heroin and sell his own product back in the United States. One evening when going to the same American bar, a white Rolls-Royce pulled up beside Frank and asked him to get in. The word had gotten around that Frank was looking to buy hundreds of kilograms of dope. The driver took Frank to the city outskirts, stopped, and then they began to talk business. Frank was asked, "How much do you need?" After that they arranged to meet up the following day to make an official purchase. Prices for a kilo of heroin in New York was $60,000 and $70,000. The price for a kilo of heroin in Thailand was $4,200. After factoring in all of the transportation expenses, there was still a much larger profit margin to be made than buying it in the States. Frank met the real boss of the heroin supplier. He was positioned on a United States military base. He had an eagle on the shoulder of his uniform and was well protected. This would suggest that he was in the U.S. military selling and distributing heroin to the United States. Not an Asian man, the heart of the forest like the movie would suggest. This is the real reason why Frank was able to get his drugs shipped over to New York on military planes. This was how all of the other dope was going to destinations in the U.S. Frank's plan was to bribe a high-ranking U.S. serviceman. However, there was no need for that. It was all taken care of for him for $125,000. Frank bought 225 kilograms of heroin on his first batch, which was going to cost him $945,000. This was paid for by all of Bumpy's protection money. Frank was told to collect the shipment at a specific U.S. air base, and to a specific gate number. Once they arrived at gate 27, within 60 seconds it was done. The men threw 4 large duffel bags in their car. No one spoke. After this point, it marked an important part in his criminal entrepreneurship. Once he had the dope, he was a distributor instead of a street dealer. He simply dealt with the supply and demand, not dealing with street junkies. He simply imported heroin like any other product. The huge demand there was on the streets was largely used to counter any personal guilt that Frank Lucus was feeling, used as a distraction to the misery his product was creating for a terrible heroin addiction. Just as cigarette companies supply cigarettes, they do not think twice about the health damage they cause people, simply supply and demand. 3 weeks after the initial deal, Frank was back in Bangkok with his dealer. He had to pay the remaining amount that he owed from the first deal, and then arrange another shipment of 500 kilograms this time. After the second shipment, other crime bosses were interested in buying from Frank directly, and so Frank arranged meetings to do so. Frank could sell kilograms of heroin to street kingpins at a cheaper price than his competition, largely because it was a lot cheaper than buying it from the Far East. This meant crime bosses from all over America were interested in buying from Frank, which made him very popular very quickly. The name of the Asian dope dealer was not known, however his second in command was called 007. He was the one that Frank spoke to arrange buying the dope. The biggest driver to his venture was to be in charge of his own destiny, to be his own boss, and to be free from depending on another person to generate money for himself. On Frank's third trip back to Bangkok, he asked 007 to see where his product was coming from. So Frank then went on a trip into the heart of the jungle to where his product was getting produced. In the heart of the jungle there were acres of poppy fields as far as the eye could see. Fields and fields of poppy plants covered in black netting. The black netting made it impossible to see the fields from the sky. On the way back, Frank got attacked from a guerrilla group operating in the jungle and got malaria. Close to death, Frank somehow made it out alive, just. As the trips to Bangkok went into the double figures, it became harder to smuggle the heroin back to the U.S. U.S. Army generals that were getting paid off started to leave Vietnam, as the war was coming to an end, and others didn't want to take the risk of getting caught. Frank, in an act of desperation, started to use U.S. servicemen coffins to smuggle it back. He got 2 joiners and a load of wood for them to build new coffins that had secret compartments in the bottom half of them. Back in New York City at Frank's home, Frank, being a country boy, had a small farm. He had animals that he looked after and killed for meat. One of his cows that he raised from a young calf into a fully grown adult was like a pet to him. Sambo was his name. One day, out of an unknown reason, he said to the butcher to kill Sambo for a Sunday family meal with his family. After seeing butchered Sambo on his plate, he felt guilty and disgusted by what he did. He had betrayed a friend, a beloved pet, and refused to eat the meat. This event really started to make Frank question all of the bad things he had done, make him confront all of the suffering his product was causing. At this point, Frank's conscience was catching up with him. He felt sorry, living a privileged life, while his products were creating misery and suffering for the heroin addicts and their families involved. After making millions of dollars, Frank wanted to get out of the drug game. He was influencing his siblings. People a lot younger than him wanted to be hustling in the streets and playing a dangerous lifestyle. His conscience was again questioning his methods. Frank wanted to get out while he was ahead, and set a positive example to his family instead of his legacy all about selling heroin. Frank's brothers working for was not a thing Frank orchestrated, quite the opposite. He knew the dangers of drug selling on the streets, so never wanted his close family members involved. They all came to Frank looking to make money with what he had already built. Contrary to everything written about him, he actively tried to discourage his brothers, but he could not stop them wanting to get involved. Frank suggested to his brothers about creating legitimate businesses rather than a drug business. Frank was planning a way out even when he was making lots of money. He was grown weary of all the street hustling and wanted out of it all. Additionally, he was grown paranoid as he was a marked man. Everybody knew who he was at this point. Losing his riches. Frank was arrested and sent to prison. He was asserted, and all of his assets were seized. Frank Lucus lost everything and all of his money, most of it stolen by Ben coppers. Richie Roberts did not arrest Frank Lucus. Frank Lucus was already in prison serving a 40-year sentence. Richie Roberts was an assistant in the SS prosecutor's office when he approached Frank. Richie Roberts needed Frank to assist him in nailing Ben cops in the police force. In return, he would get time for his sentence. He needed stories of Ben cops and evidence. Richie Roberts was honest and had plenty of integrity, which made Frank listen to him and work with him. Eventually, Frank was released and was a free man after many years in prison. Frank was 50 years old and had no money or any other possessions. The glory days were truly over, and now Frank, at 50 years old, was living with his mother. He was 50 years old, depending on his mother for food and shelter. Sitting in the living room watching wrestling. Frank was on day parole, meaning he had to report to his parole officer. After not going after 6 months, he was arrested and facing life imprisonment. Frank began to question if all of it was worth it. After pleading to the jury that he had to look after his mother, he was lucky given a second chance. At the release of the film, Frank did not appear at the premiere. The film highlighted many of his deep regrets and mistakes in life. It hit home all of the damage he had done. Instead of looking cool and glamorous, he was mature and regretful for all of his greed and ignorance. Summary reflections. Frank says, I write this book and outline all my successes and my failings in honor of every single person affected directly or indirectly by the evils of the heroin trade. I made some decisions that affected many people in my life. I am 78 years old today and I still have a lifetime of regret, and every word in this book is dedicated to those I impacted in any way. His own words is to not follow the path he went down. Stay in school, finish high school and earn the highest level degree in education that you can. This is the way to go in life.